"Is that really the best you can do, ma'am?" The question echoed through courtroom 12 with just enough sarcasm to stop every whispered conversation in its tracks. Heads turned almost in perfect unison toward the woman standing quietly near the counsel table. Judge Richard Caldwell leaned back in his polished oak chair, his silver reading glasses resting low on his nose, his expression carrying the practiced confidence of a man who believed every word spoken inside his courtroom began and ended with him. The afternoon sunlight poured through the tall courthouse windows, casting long golden bars across the marble floor, while the American flag behind the bench stood perfectly still in the conditioned air. Danielle Brooks didn't answer immediately. She simply folded the worn leather folder in her hands, her posture calm, her breathing even, refusing to let the tension around her dictate her own. To nearly everyone watching, she looked completely ordinary. Her navy blazer had clearly been tailored years ago, her shoes were practical rather than fashionable, and her silver curls framed a face marked more by quiet wisdom than by wealth or status. A few people seated in the gallery exchanged knowing glances. Some assumed she had misunderstood the legal process. Others quietly concluded she had wandered into a dispute far beyond her understanding. No one bothered asking who she really was. Judge Caldwell tapped his pen once against the polished bench. "This court doesn't operate on opinions from spectators," he said, his voice smooth enough to sound polite while carrying the unmistakable weight of dismissal. A faint ripple of restrained laughter floated through the gallery before disappearing beneath the heavy silence of the courtroom. Danielle slowly lifted her eyes toward the bench. Her expression never changed. There was no embarrassment. No anger. Only patience. The kind earned after years of listening before speaking. Caldwell noticed her composure and seemed almost irritated by it. He had presided over thousands of hearings across nearly 3 decades. Attorneys stood straighter when he entered the room. Witnesses stumbled over their own words beneath his gaze. Young prosecutors rehearsed for weeks before appearing before him. Authority surrounded him like the polished mahogany walls themselves. It had become second nature to believe he could recognize influence the moment it walked through his courtroom doors. Danielle Brooks did not fit any of those expectations. She carried no expensive briefcase. She wore no judicial robe. No one greeted her with special attention. Even the bailiff had simply nodded as she entered earlier that afternoon. She appeared to be exactly what everyone assumed, a quiet black woman attending a routine public hearing alone. Caldwell glanced briefly toward the clerk before returning his attention to Danielle. "If you have business before this court, you'll wait until you're addressed properly," he said. "Otherwise, I suggest you simply observe and learn." Again, the room settled into uneasy silence. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Someone shifted in the back row. A page of legal documents turned somewhere near the prosecution table. Danielle lowered her eyes for only a second, gently brushing an invisible speck of dust from the corner of her folder with her thumb. She neither argued nor protested. She simply nodded once, as though she had heard something far less important than everyone else believed had just happened. Around the courtroom, people relaxed, assuming the uncomfortable exchange had ended exactly as these moments usually did. What none of them realized was that the hearing had already begun, revealing far more about the judge than about the quiet woman standing before him. The hearing moved forward, but Danielle Brooks remained exactly where she had been standing, quietly observing every word with the steady attention of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding that people often revealed themselves long before they realized it. At 46 years old, she had learned that silence could expose more truth than interruption ever could. Growing up on the south side of Baltimore, she had watched her mother work double shifts at a public library while her father served as a city bus driver for more than 30 years. Neither of them had spoken often about success. But they repeated one lesson so consistently that it became part of who she was. Respect was something you gave first, not because another person had earned it, but because your own character demanded it. Danielle carried that lesson into every stage of her life. She had earned scholarships instead of favors, promotions instead of shortcuts, and trust instead of attention. Friends often joked that she dressed like someone who never needed to prove anything, and in many ways they were right. She preferred simple jackets, practical shoes, and a leather folder that had traveled with her through countless meetings over expensive accessories that invited unnecessary questions. That afternoon, no one inside the courthouse recognized the quiet woman sitting near the front row because she had chosen to arrive without an assistant, without security, and without the formal introductions that usually accompanied her position. She believed that institutions could only be understood honestly when people acted naturally, and people only acted naturally when they believed no one important was watching. The courthouse itself reflected decades of history. The limestone walls carried portraits of retired judges whose names decorated conference rooms throughout the building. Bronze plaques honored legal traditions stretching back generations. Attorneys hurried through polished hallways balancing stacks of files and coffee cups, speaking in hurried voices about motions, deadlines, and appeals. Every person seemed focused on procedure. Danielle watched something different. She noticed the nervous witness whose hands never stopped shaking. She noticed the young public defender encouraging his client with a reassuring smile before returning to his seat. She noticed the elderly janitor quietly polishing fingerprints from the wooden rail without anyone acknowledging his presence. Small moments mattered to her because they revealed the culture hidden beneath official rules. As the clerk continued reading the next matter on the docket, Danielle opened her folder just enough to review a neatly organized page of handwritten notes. There were no names highlighted in red. No dramatic accusations. Only careful observations written in tidy script beside precise timestamps. Her fountain pen rested across the page, untouched for the moment, while she listened to every exchange with remarkable patience. Across the room, Judge Richard Caldwell appeared increasingly comfortable, his confidence growing with every routine ruling. His voice filled the courtroom with practiced authority, and those around him responded almost automatically. Lawyers adjusted their arguments to match his expectations. Court staff anticipated his requests before he finished speaking. It was a system built upon habit, and habits often became invisible to the people living inside them. Danielle quietly closed the folder once more and folded her hands across it. A beam of late afternoon sunlight drifted across the courtroom floor until it rested near her polished shoes. She looked toward the bench again with the same calm expression she had worn since entering the building, giving no indication that every passing minute was confirming exactly why she had chosen to spend the afternoon in courtroom 12. Judge Richard Caldwell had spent almost 28 years convincing himself that experience alone was proof of wisdom. Every morning he entered the courthouse through the private judicial entrance at precisely 8:15, exchanged brief greetings with deputies who respected his punctuality, and walked the familiar hallway lined with framed photographs of former judges whose reputations had become part of the building itself. His chambers overlooked the city skyline, a view he often admired while sipping black coffee before the first hearing of the day. To him, the courthouse represented order, and he believed he was one of the few people capable of preserving it. Younger attorneys admired his confidence, although many quietly feared appearing before him. They knew he demanded precision, disliked hesitation, and rarely tolerated anyone who challenged his interpretation of procedure. Over time, that reputation had evolved into something larger than authority. It had become certainty. Caldwell no longer questioned whether his first impression of someone might be incomplete because his instincts had rewarded him for decades. He believed he could identify competence within seconds simply by observing posture, clothing, vocabulary, and confidence. It was a habit so deeply rooted that he hardly realized he was making judgments before people even finished introducing themselves. Throughout the afternoon, he continued moving through the docket with practiced efficiency. One attorney received a sharp reminder to organize his exhibits properly. Another was interrupted halfway through an explanation because Caldwell insisted the point was already obvious. Court staff responded quickly to every request, anticipating his expectations before he voiced them. The rhythm of the courtroom revolved around him like clockwork, reinforcing the belief that control and correctness were the same thing. From the gallery, observers watched him with admiration, assuming confidence naturally belonged to the person wearing the robe. Danielle Brooks remained quiet, but her attention never drifted. She noticed the subtle details others overlooked. Each time someone spoke, Caldwell maintained steady eye contact with attorneys from prestigious firms, often allowing them additional time to explain their arguments. Yet when ordinary citizens addressed the court without polished legal language, his patience seemed noticeably shorter. His voice became firmer. His expressions less forgiving. His questions more dismissive. None of it violated courtroom rules outright, but together they painted a picture that only careful observation could reveal. A young law student seated several rows behind Danielle leaned toward another in turn and whispered that Judge Caldwell had always been known for running an efficient courtroom. Danielle heard the comment without reacting. Efficiency, she knew, could sometimes become a comfortable disguise for assumptions that no longer deserved protection. The clerk announced the next procedural matter, and Caldwell adjusted the papers before him without looking up. His pen moved confidently across the margin of a legal brief while he listened with only half his attention. The polished wooden bench reflected the afternoon sunlight, making the courtroom appear warm despite the cool air circulating through the ventilation system. Outside the tall windows, an American flag fluttered gently above the courthouse plaza, visible between the stone columns. Inside, the atmosphere remained orderly, almost predictable. Caldwell finally looked toward Danielle again, noticing that she had continued writing occasional notes inside her folder. His eyebrows narrowed slightly. There was something about her quiet composure that unsettled him, not because she had spoken out of turn again, but because she seemed completely unaffected by his earlier dismissal. Most people either became defensive or apologetic after being corrected from the bench. Danielle had done neither. She simply observed, listened, and recorded. To Caldwell, that restraint felt strangely defiant. Without realizing it, he had already begun treating the quiet woman in the gallery as someone whose place needed to be firmly defined before the day was over. The next case appeared routine at first glance, a procedural dispute involving public records and administrative deadlines, the kind of hearing that usually passed without attracting much attention. A young attorney stood at the podium flipping nervously through a stack of documents while his client waited beside him, shoulders tense beneath an inexpensive gray suit. Judge Richard Caldwell listened for less than 30 seconds before raising one hand. "Counsel, spare the court the unnecessary background. Get to the point." The attorney swallowed, nodded quickly, and attempted to summarize, but in his haste he overlooked a required filing date printed near the bottom of one exhibit. Danielle Brooks noticed it immediately. The date did not match the clerk's earlier timeline. She glanced once at the official docket displayed on the courtroom monitor, then back to the exhibit. The inconsistency was small, almost invisible, yet it changed the sequence of events entirely. She remained silent for another moment, giving both the attorney and the court an opportunity to recognize the discrepancy themselves. Neither did. Judge Caldwell reached for his pen. "Based on what has been presented, the court is prepared to rule." Danielle slowly rose from her seat. Every movement was deliberate, calm, and respectful. The soft sound of her chair sliding across the polished floor drew several curious glances from the gallery. She waited until the courtroom was completely quiet before speaking in an even voice. "Your Honor, may I respectfully bring one procedural inconsistency to the court's attention?" Caldwell looked up, his expression tightening almost instantly. "I do not recall inviting commentary from the gallery." Danielle kept her hands folded around her leather folder. "I understand, Your Honor. However, the filing date on Exhibit 4 appears inconsistent with the docket entered by the clerk earlier today. If the dates are compared, the sequence of notice may affect whether the administrative deadline had actually expired." Several attorneys instinctively looked down at their own copies of the documents. The young lawyer blinked in surprise and hurriedly searched through the pages. Even the courtroom clerk glanced toward the electronic docket with a hint of uncertainty. For one brief second, silence settled over the room like dust floating through the afternoon sunlight. Judge Caldwell noticed the hesitation spreading across the courtroom, and his jaw tightened. Instead of reviewing the document immediately, he leaned forward and fixed his attention entirely on Danielle. Ma'am, he said, his voice carrying across every wooden bench in the room, this courtroom follows established legal procedure, not observations from spectators who believe reading a document qualifies them to interrupt judicial proceedings. A faint, uncomfortable laugh escaped from somewhere in the back row before disappearing almost immediately. Danielle neither flinched nor lowered her eyes. I meant no interruption, Your Honor. Only to ensure the record remains accurate before a ruling is entered. Caldwell gave a short, dismissive smile that never reached his eyes. Accuracy is precisely why trained professionals handle these matters. That responsibility does not belong to visitors. The words lingered in the courtroom long after he finished speaking. The young attorney looked from the exhibit to the judge and back again, clearly uncertain whether he should continue reviewing the dates. The clerk hesitated with one hand resting above the keyboard, waiting for further instruction. Danielle quietly nodded once, accepting the response without argument. She returned to her seat with the same measured composure she had displayed all afternoon, gently closing her folder before resting both hands upon it. Yet across the courtroom, several people found themselves looking once more at the document she had mentioned, and although no one spoke another word, an unexpected uncertainty had entered the room, one that even the confident judge could no longer completely control. The stillness that followed felt heavier than any raised voice. Judge Richard Caldwell lowered his pen onto the bench with deliberate care, the faint click echoing through the courtroom as every pair of eyes shifted between him and Danielle Brooks. His expression remained controlled, yet the confidence that usually settled every question now carried an unmistakable edge of irritation. He had spent too many years maintaining unquestioned authority to welcome uncertainty from someone he believed had no standing in the proceedings. He looked toward the courtroom clerk without acknowledging the document Danielle had mentioned. Proceed with the record exactly as presented, he instructed. The clerk hesitated for the briefest moment before nodding, although the hesitation itself did not escape the notice of those seated closest to the bench. The young attorney standing at the podium finally gathered enough courage to clear his throat. Your Honor, if I may, perhaps I should verify the filing date before the court enters a final ruling. Caldwell's eyes settled on the attorney with quiet disapproval. Counsel, are you suggesting this court delays its schedule because of unsolicited remarks from a spectator? The attorney immediately lowered his gaze. No, Your Honor. Then continue. The answer came so quickly that no further discussion seemed possible. Danielle remained seated, her hands resting calmly on the closed leather folder. She neither attempted to speak again nor showed any sign of frustration. Her silence contrasted sharply with the growing discomfort spreading across the room. Several attorneys discreetly compared documents on their tables. A law student flipped through a copy of the procedural rules, trying to understand why such a simple question had generated such visible tension. Even the elderly janitor paused his work near the rear doorway, sensing that something inside the courtroom had shifted beyond ordinary legal disagreement. Judge Caldwell signed the preliminary order with one confident stroke of his pen. The sound of ink moving across paper seemed unusually loud in the quiet room. As he handed the document toward the clerk, Danielle watched without changing expression. She was not watching the signature itself. She was watching the decision to avoid verification. That distinction mattered. Caldwell looked toward her once again. This court expects visitors to respect judicial process, he said firmly. Repeated interruptions may result in removal from the courtroom. His words hung in the air with unmistakable authority. No one doubted he possessed the power to enforce them. A deputy standing near the entrance instinctively adjusted his posture, awaiting any further instruction from the bench. Danielle slowly stood, not in defiance, but out of courtesy. I understand, Your Honor, she replied in the same calm voice she had maintained all afternoon. I have no intention of disrupting your proceedings. Her answer contained neither apology nor challenge. It simply acknowledged his authority while preserving her own dignity. Somehow that composure seemed to unsettle Caldwell even more than open disagreement would have. He gave a brief nod, signaling that she should remain silent, then immediately called the next matter on the docket. The courtroom resumed its familiar rhythm, yet the atmosphere no longer felt routine. Conversations became quieter. Court staff exchanged subtle glances. The young attorney continued looking back at the exhibit he had nearly overlooked, unable to shake the feeling that something important remained unresolved. Danielle sat down once more and gently opened her folder. Without hurry, she wrote a single additional note beneath the earlier observations, her handwriting steady and precise. She closed the folder again before anyone could glimpse the page inside. The afternoon sun had shifted lower now, filling the courtroom with long shadows stretching across the marble floor. Outside, the courthouse appeared unchanged, but inside courtroom 12, an invisible line had been crossed. Judge Caldwell believed he had successfully protected the authority of his bench. Danielle understood that he had revealed something far more significant than authority, and she knew the day was moving steadily toward a moment that no one else in the room could yet imagine. The courtroom settled into an unusual quiet that could not be explained by procedure alone. The final words of the previous exchange still lingered in the air, not because anyone wished to repeat them, but because everyone had sensed that something unseen had quietly changed. Judge Richard Caldwell returned his attention to the docket, calling the next matter with the same measured authority he had demonstrated all afternoon, yet the rhythm no longer felt effortless. The pages before him remained perfectly aligned, his pen rested exactly where it always did, and the polished wooden bench reflected the warm glow of the lowering sun, but confidence built over decades had encountered something it could not immediately dismiss. Danielle Brooks sat motionless, her leather folder resting across her lap. She did not write another note. She did not glance around the room searching for reactions. Instead, she watched the proceedings with the same calm focus she had carried since walking through the courthouse doors hours earlier. Patience had always been one of her greatest disciplines. Her father used to tell her that people often spoke the loudest when silence gave them enough room to reveal themselves. She remembered those words now as the afternoon light stretched farther across the marble floor, painting long golden reflections beneath the rows of wooden benches. Somewhere beyond the tall courthouse windows, church bells marked the passing hour, their distant chimes softened by thick limestone walls. Inside the courtroom, even the ordinary sound seemed more noticeable than before. A clerk carefully stacked completed case files. An attorney quietly capped his fountain pen. The heating and cooling system released a gentle rush of air that stirred the corner of an American flag standing behind the bench. No one hurried to speak. No one seemed eager to disturb the fragile stillness that had settled over the room. Danielle lowered her eyes briefly to the closed folder resting beneath her hands. Inside were neatly organized observations collected throughout the afternoon, each one written without emotion, without exaggeration, and without personal opinion. Facts required no decoration. They only required accuracy. She thought about the countless public servants she had met throughout her career, many of whom carried enormous responsibility with remarkable humility. They understood that authority was not measured by how easily it silenced others, but by how willingly it listened before reaching conclusions. That belief had guided every professional decision she had ever made, and it remained unchanged even now. Across the courtroom, Judge Caldwell adjusted his glasses before reviewing another motion. For the first time all day, however, he paused longer than usual before speaking. His eyes briefly settled on a paragraph within the filing, then shifted almost instinctively toward Danielle. She remained exactly as she had been for the past several minutes, composed, attentive, and completely untroubled by the attention directed her way. There was no trace of resentment in her expression. No satisfaction. No desire to embarrass anyone. Her quiet confidence seemed to exist independently of the courtroom itself, as though it had been formed long before this afternoon and would remain long after everyone else had gone home. The sunlight continued drifting slowly across the room until it reached the first step leading to the bench, illuminating tiny particles of dust suspended in the still air. The courthouse clock advanced another minute. Outside, people crossed the plaza carrying briefcases and coffee cups, unaware that inside courtroom 12 an ordinary hearing was gradually becoming something far more significant. Neither the attorneys nor the spectators understood why the atmosphere felt different, but they all sensed it. Sometimes the most important turning points arrived without raised voices or dramatic gestures. Sometimes they arrived in the form of a patient silence, waiting for the truth to reveal itself at exactly the right moment. The final matter on the afternoon docket was about to begin when the courtroom doors opened with a quiet, deliberate motion. No one looked up immediately because people entered and left courtrooms throughout the day without attracting attention. It was only when the chief clerk from the administrative office stepped inside carrying a sealed portfolio that conversations stopped on their own. The clerk was well known throughout the courthouse. He rarely interrupted an active session unless the matter involved official judicial administration. Judge Richard Caldwell looked up with mild annoyance. "Is there an emergency?" he asked. The chief clerk approached the bench with measured steps before speaking in a respectful voice. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. I was instructed to deliver these materials personally before today's observation concludes." One word lingered in the room. Observation. Several attorneys exchanged puzzled looks. Caldwell accepted the portfolio without opening it. "Observation," he repeated. Before the chief clerk answered, his eyes moved past the bench toward the first row of the gallery. His expression changed immediately. He offered a courteous nod that carried unmistakable professional respect. "Good afternoon, Madam Chair," he said clearly. Every sound inside the courtroom disappeared. The young attorney at counsel table slowly lowered the document in his hands. The law student sitting near the back looked from the clerk to Danielle Brooks in complete confusion. Even the deputy standing beside the courtroom entrance straightened instinctively. Danielle rose with the same calm dignity she had shown throughout the afternoon. She returned the greeting with a gentle smile. "Good afternoon." Nothing about her voice had changed, yet suddenly every person in the room heard it differently. Judge Caldwell remained motionless for a brief moment, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. "Madam Chair," he asked quietly. The chief clerk turned respectfully toward the bench. "Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Danielle Brooks serves as chair of the State Judicial Oversight Commission. Today's visit was one of several scheduled observational reviews conducted across the state judiciary. She requested that no advance notice be given so normal courtroom operations could be observed without preparation." The words settled over the courtroom with astonishing weight. Caldwell looked toward Danielle, searching her face for some sign that this was a misunderstanding. There was none. She stood exactly as she had before, composed and gracious, holding the same worn leather folder everyone had dismissed as ordinary. Suddenly that folder no longer appeared ordinary at all. It represented hours of careful observation, every note written with patience instead of emotion. Caldwell's thoughts raced back through the afternoon. The respectful request to verify the filing date. The measured tone. The absence of argument. The warning he had delivered from the bench. The assumptions he had made before learning a single fact about the woman before him. He realized that no one had hidden Danielle's identity. He had simply never considered asking who she was. Around the courtroom, understanding spread across every face. The clerk who had hesitated earlier quietly lowered her eyes. The young attorney remembered the overlooked exhibit. The spectators who had exchanged amused glances now sat perfectly still. Danielle opened her leather folder one final time, not dramatically, but with the same deliberate care she had shown all afternoon. She removed a single identification card bearing the official seal of the commission and placed it gently on the counsel table before closing the folder once again. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse anyone. She simply met Judge Caldwell's eyes with quiet compassion, allowing the truth to speak for itself in a courtroom where silence had suddenly become more powerful than authority. Judge Richard Caldwell remained standing behind the bench long after the chief clerk finished speaking. For the first time in nearly 3 decades on that bench, the familiar courtroom no longer felt like a place completely under his control. The polished wood, the orderly rows of benches, the framed state seal behind him, all remained exactly the same, yet everything seemed different because he now understood that the most important judgment delivered that afternoon had not come from him. It had come from his own conduct. He slowly removed his reading glasses and placed them beside the stack of case files before looking directly at Danielle Brooks. The confidence that had shaped every word he had spoken earlier had given way to something far more difficult. Honest reflection. The silence stretched across the courtroom until he finally spoke. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." No one moved. Every attorney, deputy, clerk, and observer remained perfectly still. Caldwell continued, choosing each word carefully. "I believed I understood who you were before I knew anything about you. I dismissed your observation without giving it the consideration every person deserves. That was my failure, not yours." His voice carried none of the authority it had earlier that afternoon. Instead, it carried humility. Danielle listened without interrupting. Her expression remained calm, unchanged by the revelation of her position or by the apology now offered before an entire courtroom. She had witnessed moments like this throughout her career. Some apologies were offered because people feared consequences. Others came because they finally recognized the distance between their values and their actions. She quietly stepped forward, stopping several feet from the bench. "Your Honor," she replied gently, "every person who serves the public carries difficult responsibilities. None of us is measured by whether we make mistakes. We are measured by what we choose after we recognize them." Her words filled the courtroom without sounding like criticism. They sounded like an invitation to become better. Caldwell lowered his eyes for a moment before nodding slowly. The chief clerk remained silent, understanding that nothing else needed to be added. Danielle opened her leather folder once more and removed several neatly organized pages. Instead of presenting criticism, she carefully separated one sheet from the others. "Your courtroom demonstrates preparation, efficiency, and respect for procedure," she said. "Those strengths deserve recognition. Today's observations also identify opportunities to ensure every individual who enters this courtroom feels equally heard before conclusions are reached." She placed the summary on the clerk's desk rather than handing it directly to the judge. It was a small gesture, but one that reflected the principle she had always believed. Institutions improve through process, not humiliation. Caldwell looked at the report without touching it immediately. He understood that every note inside had been written long before anyone knew who Danielle truly was. Nothing had been exaggerated. Nothing had been personal. Only facts remained. Around the courtroom, the atmosphere softened. The young attorney who had nearly overlooked the filing date allowed himself a quiet breath of relief. The clerk who had hesitated earlier offered Danielle a grateful smile. Even the elderly janitor standing near the rear doorway seemed to stand a little taller, reminded that dignity belonged equally to everyone inside the building. Danielle gently closed her folder for the final time and prepared to leave. She had not come seeking recognition, revenge, or embarrassment for anyone. She had come searching for truth, and truth had revealed itself without anger, without raised voices, and without anyone needing to lose their humanity. As Judge Caldwell watched her turn toward the courtroom doors, he understood that the greatest lesson of the day had not been about judicial authority at all. It had been about the quiet strength required to treat every person with respect before knowing the title they carried. 1 week later, the courthouse looked exactly as it always had. The limestone columns still caught the morning sunlight, attorneys still hurried through the front entrance carrying heavy briefcases, and the familiar sound of footsteps echoed across the polished marble floors. Yet inside courtroom 12, something subtle had changed. Judge Richard Caldwell arrived at the bench a few minutes earlier than usual. Before the first case was called, he looked across the nearly empty courtroom, noticing details he had overlooked for years. He watched the clerk arranging files with careful precision. He thanked the deputy who opened the courtroom doors. When the first attorney approached the podium, Caldwell listened without interruption until every sentence had been completed. Those present noticed the difference immediately, although no one mentioned it aloud. Later that afternoon, a nervous young woman appeared without legal representation. She struggled to explain her situation, frequently losing her place while searching through a folder filled with handwritten notes. Instead of stopping her, Caldwell waited patiently. When she finished, he quietly asked the clerk to verify one document before making any ruling. The request lasted less than 2 minutes, yet it reminded everyone in the courtroom that careful listening often required very little time. Across the state, the Judicial Oversight Commission completed its routine evaluation. Danielle Brooks reviewed the final report exactly as she reviewed every other observation collected throughout her career. The document acknowledged strengths, identified areas for improvement, and recognized the judge's immediate willingness to reflect upon his conduct after understanding the full circumstances. There was no language of punishment. No unnecessary criticism. The purpose had never been to embarrass public servants. It had always been to strengthen public trust. Danielle signed the completed evaluation with the same steady handwriting that had filled her notebook throughout the courthouse visit. She closed the file and placed it carefully into the commission archive before moving on to the next courthouse scheduled for observation. She never requested publicity. She never spoke publicly about what had happened inside courtroom 12. For her, the most meaningful victories were the ones that quietly improved the lives of people she would never meet. Months later, attorneys began noticing a different atmosphere whenever they entered Judge Caldwell's courtroom. New lawyers felt less intimidated. Ordinary citizens spoke without being hurried. Court staff discovered that questions were welcomed rather than dismissed. The courtroom remained orderly, but respect no longer depended upon status or appearance. It belonged equally to every person who stepped through the doors. On one quiet autumn evening, after the final hearing had ended, Caldwell remained alone for a few extra minutes before leaving his bench. The golden light of the setting sun streamed through the tall windows, stretching across the empty courtroom until it reached the first row where Danielle Brooks had quietly sat during that unforgettable afternoon. He stood in silence, remembering not the revelation of her position, but the grace she had shown when she possessed every opportunity to respond with anger. He understood at last that authority earned obedience, but character earned trust. Outside, a gentle breeze moved the American flag above the courthouse steps as people continued walking through the city, unaware that one ordinary afternoon had quietly changed the course of a courtroom. Danielle Brooks disappeared into the crowd carrying the same worn leather folder she had always carried, needing no introduction and expecting no applause. The building behind her remained standing in stone, but its strongest foundation had never been marble or law books. It had always been the simple decision to see the humanity in another person before making any judgment at all.